Welcome to Inside the Bible, produced here at Andrews University. I'm joined today on set by my friends Felicia Dattis and Andrew Abbott.
Hi everyone, are you ready to share your experiences with us? Well then go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/InsideTheBible. Share your experiences, your thoughts, your questions, and don't forget to invite your family and friends to join us on this journey.
From the impressive monuments to the monumental tombs, Egypt has caught the attention of the world. New discoveries are presented to the public on a regular basis. Egyptomania gripped the world with the discovery of King Tut's tomb in the early 1900s, and it still grips my heart and many others. Mummies, temples, curses, hieroglyphics, the mystery of one of the world's most dominant and long-lasting civilization stirs the imagination. When counting combinations and foreign deities worshipped on the bank of the longest river in the world, Egypt had over 1,500 gods and goddesses. It was amongst all of this that our next investigation takes place.
At this point, Jacob's descendants have settled down in the mighty nation of Egypt after Joseph had brought them back to his home from the land of Canaan. The Israelites now live in a land of plenty, but they also feel threatened by a Pharaoh who has no interest in honoring Joseph's service to Egypt. Without the protection of the state, slavery soon begins.
So what happened next? I hope you're ready to find out because the investigation starts right now.
Joseph and Moses never actually met each other, but they shared a very direct link through family ties. In fact, Moses and his siblings were the descendants of Levi. Levi was one of the half-brothers of Joseph who migrated to Egypt after Joseph invited his family over. But there are questions such as, historically, when did the story of Moses and the Exodus take place? Was it very far removed from the time of Joseph? And what did the Hebrews face as slaves in Egypt? How can we compare the slavery of the Egyptians to the slavery that we think of mostly in the United States that happened well over 100 years ago? Well, Robert and I sat down with some theologians to start piecing together this story.
Well, welcome. Let's talk a little bit about Moses. His early life obviously wasn't in the best of situations. So let's put it mildly. Let's talk about his context of slavery for a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Thinking of slavery, just the impact it has on the different facets of a person. I mean, usually when we think of slavery, you think of the heavy hauling, the whips, the yelling, all that sort of thing. But
the physicality of it.
The physicality of it, scars, probably had big muscles. But anyway, for them emotionally, what must have been doing to them? You see the outward person. What's going on inside the head when they're constantly being yelled at and whipped and broken down slowly but surely every single day of their lives?
And sadly, in this country, we have recent historical context where we can see how this does affect people, potentially affects generations.
Well, I agree with you both, but at the same time, historically, you need to kind of separate them. The slavery that we saw that recently, North America experienced is completely different than what Rome, Medo-Persia, Greece, and even Egypt had. The reason I'm saying that is because yes, they were oppressive, and yes, there was some physical aspects of it to it, but at the same time, a lot of it they valued their slaves tremendously. So while you were a slave, at the same time, they had a little bit of freedom, and they didn't experience at the same time. They didn't experience the barbarism that we see today. That's my opinion, anyways. So,
one thing you should know about slavery in ancient Egypt is that it was not like slavery in ancient Rome. In that sense, it meant that everybody had rights. Here's something that you probably don't know, that slaves could own their own property. Indeed, slaves could own other slaves. They could hire out themselves to work in other places. Essentially, the slavery that we know in ancient Rome did not exist at all in ancient Egypt. Indeed, a slave could have their own personal possessions. They could marry whom they chose. They could cultivate their own land. When they died, they could pass on whatever their possessions may be to whomever they chose.
What made them a slave, though, is that they weren't free to leave. And they weren't free to choose what work they did.
Okay.
But they were paid. They were paid not in money, because there was no money until the time of the Persians. They were paid in kind, so to speak. They were given food and that sort of thing.
Interesting. So it's almost like they were lifetime contract workers, you could say, in a way, if we were put it in modern terms.
Exactly, and I mean, there certainly would have been beatings and different things like that, but it wouldn't have been the kind of we own you, so to speak, as it was so much in the Civil War time.
Now, we know this to be true in the Bible as well, because think about when they left, when all of the Hebrews left, what did they take with them? They had flocks, they had possessions, and other people came with them. They even had gold jewelry, because this is the gold jewelry that they used in order to make the golden calf. Are we talking about slaves here? Because our idea of what slavery is very different than what slavery was in ancient Egypt.
Exodus chapter 1 describes the Hebrews being put into slavery in Egypt, where they were forced to build two cities, Pithom and Ramses. The ancient Egyptians built cities, including the palaces, out of mud brick, a temporary building material, but they built lasting monuments, tombs and temples out of stone, because those were houses for eternity. The Egyptians believed that this life was a temporary life. What happened in this life only mattered as it related to the next life, the eternal life. And this was represented in how they built their houses and structures. The Hebrews would have built mud brick in much the same way as you see this brick here. This is a brick from the 19th dynasty, from the second Ramses. And here in front is a brick mold. The clay would have been mixed with straw and water, put into the mold, and then dropped to dry in the sun. Once it hardened, it was then used for building.
I think that she probably put it there on purpose.
Amram and Jochebed, they at some point had to put their faith to the test.
What is really fun is that she decides she wanted to raise this child.
Do you believe that God has a purpose for your life?
I think he does. Some of the hardest parts is trying to figure out what that is.
Jeremiah 29:11 says, "I have a plan for you," and I believe that. So,
as grown up as a Seventh-day Adventist, that's all I hear, and even like reading the scriptures and stuff like that, I believe that certain things happen for a reason, especially when you have God in your life.
I was always taught that he'd have a plan, grew Christian parents and stuff, so that was always something that was just told to me, and I'm still working that out, but I believe, I'm going to figure it out one of these days.
I feel this way because the way that I wanted things to play out has not played out. However, everything that God has revealed to me has played out, and even the things that he has revealed to me for the future, I'm seeing them come together, and I know for a fact that that's only because of God.
When we look at the experience of Jochebed, the Bible says that when she saw the child was a beautiful child, that she hid him for 3 months. But when she realized she could not hide him anymore, that's when she made this basket of asphalt and pitch and put him on a river. Mothers today, they see the good in their child. They see how beautiful their child is, and they would do anything to protect their baby. As a matter of fact, researchers have concluded that it's actually biological that mothers would want to protect their children. Moses' experience as a baby is one that is amazing. Let's begin this journey. Let's find out how God protected this baby even as he was floating on a river.
Let's talk about his experience as a baby. Any comments? I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
It's a famous story, of course, yes, where he's found among the rushes by the daughter of Pharaoh, and yes,
No, I was going to say that historically as well, there are other cultures who have a similar story, where one of the leaders was placed in a basket and floated down the river and so forth. So this seems to be a unique story around this part of the world, in the Middle East and Egypt and so forth. Okay. It's interesting anyways that for me, one of the most prominent characters in Scripture is, placed in this situation when other prominent leaders around the world as well, or should I say in this part of the world as well, had a similar experience.
I just, that spawned a thought in my mind because just thinking about his situation and the other stories that you're talking about, it's all like they were born for this leadership position. Mm-hmm. It's like they were born for this. The God made them this way and made it so they would find that position and that they were ready for that. And that just seems totally against how in Western culture we often idolize the concept of the self-made man, right? Or the self-made woman or whatever, where they just totally come out of rags to riches story and hit it big type of thing.
Underdog story.
Yeah, underdog story. Whereas in their concept of it, God is supervising it and there has to be someone lifting them up out of that situation so they can have that opportunity. It's interesting the contrast there.
And speaking again of him as a baby, the context of him being found, the Egyptians, they had many gods, of course. One of the gods was the Nile River. And here's a baby being gifted to the house of Pharaoh by the Nile. This is kind of how they're saying it. So this is like some special gift that they're getting from the gods, this baby. And so they would have, I think, treated him very special.
Yeah. So the main question is, who is Moses and sort of where does he come from? He was certainly born in probably the land of Goshen, that would be in the northeastern side, but we're not exactly sure where he lived. Perhaps his family was associated with the craftsmen who were building Pithom and Ramses. Oh, we don't know for sure, but we do know that when he was born, the king, the Pharaoh at that time, became concerned. He was concerned about all of these Hebrews. What would happen if a king were to come from the east and unite these Hebrews against the Pharaoh? So he felt he needed to exercise a little, population control. What is interesting is that this measure of population control is exactly the same thing that Herod would do almost 1600 years later when Jesus is born. Almost the exact same thing. What do? You're just going to prevent the babies, the male children, from being born, or you prevent them, or you kill them when they are born.
Well, we know that the slave women were allowed to nurse their own children. Okay. But if they had a stillborn child or the baby was taken away from them, they had about 3 months to recover before they had to go back to work. So here you have a family who no longer can hide a baby. You can't keep a baby from crying. At some point they're going to be found. You can't just leave them at home. So if everybody in the family has to leave, how do you hide him?
So she came up with a rather interesting idea. She made a basket, essentially, and these baskets, we even have examples, complete examples, that are in museums of this exact same type of basket. She lined it with bitumen or pitch, or basically it's sort of petroleum of some kind. She lined it with pitch, probably put in reeds inside in order to prevent it from, the boy would get kind of sticky if you think about it, if it was filled with pitch. But she probably lined it, and then she let it float in the river. Now, I think that she probably put it there on purpose.
This is the longest river in the world. They could have put him anywhere in the river. But they chose to put him in a spot where the princess would find him. Now, they had a long river to put him in. They could have put him anywhere, but they put him someplace where where the mother says to the daughter, to his sister, stand a ways away and see what happens. It's in God's hands now. This poor family, Amram and Jochebed, they at some point had to put their faith to the test. What was God going to do to the baby? They obeyed the law and put him in the river. The law didn't say you could have built a boat to put him in first. Put him in the river, but they put him in the reeds in a spot where the princess would come by and find him.
The princess came down to the water. It says she came down to bathe, and that's probably part of it, but more than likely she came down to offer what's known as libations. That is, she came down to honor the river and the river gods. Everything in Egypt was about the gods. And every princess, every member, every prince, every member of the royal family had a responsibility to honor the gods in some way. Every morning, every evening, and depending on the festival, sometimes in the middle of the day. So when she comes down there, she's more than likely presenting an offering. That required her to dip into this water, that is, into the river. And then, of course, we know the story, how she discovers that there's a basket in the reeds, and she calls for her servants to go and bring the basket to her. And in it, she immediately recognizes that this is a Hebrew child. She knows this is not an Egyptian child, this is a Hebrew child. And then, what is really fun is that she decides she wanted to raise this child. And immediately, Miriam steps into the story, and she says, I know somebody who can raise this child for you. I know someone who can be the nurse for this child. Now, what you should know about ancient Egypt is that what we call wet nurse are very, very common. Every prince, every princess had a wet nurse. That is, somebody other than their royal family who took care of them. Kind of like a babysitter who was responsible for every aspect of their life. What is especially interesting is that babysitter turned out to be Moses' actual mother.
Is this scenario like totally just out of this world rare?
Some have suggested that this was the Princess Hatshepsut.
And they hide him right there, as if he is the gift that she's looking for from the gods. Moses is a major figure in the Bible. His story is a remarkable one. But when is Moses supposed to have lived? I find the topic of chronology to be very interesting because it helps to place someone in a historical context. For Moses, the majority of thinkers assume he lived in the early 19th dynasty at the time of Ramses. But is this right? How can we know? And what can we find out about the potential background to this very important man?
So, who was this princess? Well, it says that she was the daughter of Pharaoh. And the very fact that she comes down to the river with her retainers, and I believe she was fulfilling her responsibilities to the god, probably the river god, would be my first impression, the river god. Or she came to a sacred lake. Either way, she was acting like a princess. And as a princess, she had the power to spare this child. And that's probably the only reason why he survived, in light of the fact that others who were born at the same time were killed.
Is this scenario like totally just out of this world rare in that case, or is there some precedent that we can look to where a royal family member just finds someone that they think would make a good heir and they take them into their auspices and that's the story?
So some people might have a different answer. I would say no. I would say for an Egyptian to adopt an Asiatic slave boy would be completely unheard of, because the Egyptians were quite prejudiced people. We have writings of them that they call themselves human, and every other race of people they were subhuman. There's hardly any reason to expect that an Egyptian would adopt a boy, unless that Egyptian was coming to a point in Happy, this river that was supposed to bring gifts from the gods, and she was going to do an ablution to the sun god as the sun rose in the east, and she's going to dip herself in and bathe, so to speak. Egyptian princesses don't bathe in a river. They have a lake or a pond or a pool or whatever in the palace. But here she is in the river, to the river gods, looking at this particular time of the day, where she dips herself in for a ritualistic. There has to be a ritualistic bath, and she does it here. And they hide him right there, as if he is the gift that she's looking for from the gods. And they bring this. So that's what I think probably is going on. It's some kind of dynamic like that.
Depending on when you want to put the life of Moses, whether you put him during the 16th century BC, or whether you put him a little earlier, say sometime in the 12th or 13th century BC, would determine who this princess was. Personally, I go with the more traditional view, so I would place him more in the 16th century, which is sometime during the beginning of the 18th dynasty. Now, this is a really important period in ancient Egyptian history, and it makes sense because at this time the pharaohs had a number of what we call harems. Now, literally, a harem is at the inner chambers, but it is the place where the women live. And it is a place where the pharaoh goes and where he sleeps with the members of the harem in order to try to provide heirs. So this was a princess. Now the thing is that there were many princesses at this time. Indeed, some have suggested that this was the princess Hatshepsut, who would once become the great female queen of Egypt, who reigned for 22 years. Some have suggested this, but you should also recognize that she too had a daughter. And her daughter could have easily have been that princess. Or she also had 4 sisters. And that's just on one side. From research that I did, there were at least 16 known princesses who were living at or about the time in which Moses was born. So it could have been any one of them. And those are the ones whose names have been written down. That doesn't include minor princesses and other members of the royal family. Now, Moses, when he was taken from the water and they asked, "What shall we call him?" the princess gave him a rather interesting Egyptian name. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, it's Moshe. Moshe. But in Egyptian, it's Messi.
Moses is also part of an Egyptian name. It's the last part of what we call theophoric element is usually connected with it. In Egypt, Mes or Mos means the son of or born of. And so it's usually put together with one of the Egyptian gods. Some have tried to suggest, and we won't know for sure because we just don't have that kind of information, that since Moses was taken out of the river, the Nile River, that then the name element should have been the god name for the god of the river, which is Hapi. So some have suggested that his name might have been Hapi Mos. But that's a speculation, we just don't know for sure.
Israel's actual children are described as having brought their families to Egypt because of the success Joseph enjoyed in order to save their lives from a severe famine. At some point, a new king arose in Egypt, most likely in conjunction with the rise of a new ruling family. The miraculous number of Hebrews living in Egypt at that time alarmed these rulers, leading directly to their enslavement. As the numbers continued to miraculously increase, the Egyptians grew desperate, eventually leading to a cruel law that newborn baby boys were to be drowned in the Nile. It was precisely at this point that the boy who would eventually be called Moses was born. The story of how he was saved can only be described as a miracle. Indeed, there are times in our lives today that we also feel completely helpless to change the world around us. Events spin out of control, and it takes miraculous inventions to save us.
It must have been extremely difficult for Moses' parents to lay their little infant among the bulrushes of the Nile. It must have felt like they were feeding him to the river. But they knew God had a plan, and this last resort was an expression of their faith that God would protect their baby boy. When every human strategy has been spent, then God can come in and work miracles. When we are backed up against a wall, it could very well be God's best opportunity to step in and rescue us.
Have you experienced a rescue from God? Well, we want to hear about it. Join us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Inside the Bible, and share your experience with us. Maybe you have questions. You can post those as well. And don't forget to include your family members and your friends.
But what happens next is incredible. How can a condemned slave baby be raised in an idolatrous Egyptian court and still turn out to be the man who is credited with writing the law of God that would govern the lives of billions of people living today and throughout history? Find out with us next time in our search for answers as we go inside the Bible.
He's at this point where he kind of makes a mistake, a pretty decent mistake.
He decides, this is the time. I'm a military leader. I can easily lead these people out of Egypt. We don't have to fight the Egyptians. We'll just go right on out.
It wasn't that he was a Hebrew killing an Egyptian. It was that he was a servant of the king killing another servant of the king.
So this is a man who 40 years ago was so ready to take control of the world that he killed a guy.
Exactly.
And then he just takes a back seat for 40 years.
Why didn't God just take him from this time when he was the leader of Egypt?
God himself comes down and reinstitutes him, back to the privilege that God wanted him to be in the first place.